as from now. I've just reminded myself to start it. There will be, I hope, some note-taking going on, but in any case, we'll be having the recording, and there will be a summary produced afterwards and a report of the whole conference that will be circulated. I've muted everybody except the speakers for the moment. The process is going to be, we're going to have 4 speakers who will speak for a combined total of about 1 hour, and then at 10 o'clock we'll open it up for discussion. Everybody can participate in discussion in 2 ways. Firstly, as from now, you can contribute to the chat, so please do so. A good, vibrant chat is always an encouraging sign in a workshop. Secondly, when the speakers have finished, I shall be looking for contributions. And when you want to make a contribution, you can just do it in the usual Zoom way. If you go down to the reactions button at the bottom, one of those options is simply to raise your hand. And so please raise your hand to speak, and people will be unmuted to enable them to speak in accordance with that. Okay, we have an interesting and diverse set of speakers talking about an interesting and diverse set of subjects. The unifying theme here around picking up on the general conference theme of narratives around public services, public spending, and public sector production is the relationship between the entire set of public sector spending and services to, firstly, planning in the macroeconomic sense, and secondly, specifically, planning for employment. And what we're going to have from today, out of today's meeting, is 2 contributions which will talk about, in effect, a version of what Abby Innes was saying yesterday about neoliberal planning, the actual planning of a system to minimize the role of public spending, public services, and in particular the role of public employment. And so that's the 2 main dimensions of it. Zico will be making a more theoretical contribution, which is very welcome. Again, one of the things I think that came out yesterday was the sad lack of theorizing around this area of positive relationship to planning and so on. Then finally, we're very lucky to have Damon Silvers with us, talking about not just the planning processes of the Biden administration in developing the job plans and other plans, but also the processes by which those plans were developed, which is a key issue for another big theme of this conference, which is how can academics, trade unionists, social movements collaborate in order to create new and better narratives. And obviously, the best narrative of all is ultimately government policy to actually support these things. Okay, well, we're going to start then with David Archer. David is the head person of ActionAid, is that right, David? No? Okay. Senior. Okay, sorry. It helps everybody if they're unmuted.
No, I'm just the senior lead on economic justice and public services.
Okay, that's nevertheless a great job title to have. David's going to start first because he and ActionAid have actually taken as a focus of activity over recent years the repeated appearance in IMF conditionalities of the reduction in public sector wage bills. This is an issue that makes me feel young again because way back in 1975, as a young trade union researcher, the IMF arrived in the UK and they said it's absolutely necessary for the UK, in order to get their economy right, to get rid of 50,000 civil servants. And the union turned around to me and said, "You're the research officer. You need to explain why this isn't necessary at all." So it's good. It's good to hear this, David. This is an issue that's been problematic for everybody all around the world. Thanks very much for letting us for sharing your research with us on this. And so please take us away.
Yeah, okay, and thanks very much. And it's wonderful to hear that, well, disturbing to hear that it goes back to 1975, but perhaps not surprising. I mean, this is something which we've been challenging the IMF on for a good 15, 20 years. And actually, at one point, we thought we had quite a significant breakthrough in 2007 when, as a result of pushing back on the use of public sector wage bill caps as a condition attached to loans, the executive board of the IMF backed down and said they would no longer use wage bill caps as a condition of loans. But we have nevertheless more recently found that they are back in practice at country level through coercive policy advice, even if they're no longer attached to as conditions to loans. So what I'm going to talk about really is research that we've been conducting and mobilizing that we've been doing together with Public Services International and Education International, the two union federations of public sector workers globally. And it's based on work which we've done in 15 countries, mostly in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. And it's looking at how the public sector wage bill constraints, when these are agreed by the International Monetary Fund and ministries of finance in different countries, these effectively block recruitment of new teachers, nurses, doctors, frontline health and education workers, and impose strict limits on the already very low pay of many of those existing frontline workers. And despite all of the claims that are made by the IMF, the impact is really clear and devastating. So in 2021, most of them, I'll draw on two research reports we produced, one in 2020 called Who Cares for the Future? Finance Public Gender Responsive Public Services, where we did an initial mapping and found that in 78% of the countries that we studied, the IMF had clearly recommended to ministries of finance either to cut or freeze public sector wage bills. And that was a larger report looking also at wider policies of tax and debt, as well as wider austerity policies. In 2021, we then wanted to look much more in depth again at public sector wage bill constraints in particular, and produced a report called The Public versus Austerity, Why Public Sector Wage Bill Constraints Must End. And that was based on a study over 15 countries where we looked over a 5-year period at every single IMF document agreed with ministries of finance in those 15 countries, to look at what was the policy steer, what was the direction offered. And the findings, perhaps for those of us who are familiar with this work, perhaps won't be as surprising as they might be to others, but the imposition of, or the driving of a absolutely consistent direction towards the cutting and freezing of public sector wage bills has directly blocked the achievement of sustainable development goals as a whole, and particularly in health and education, has undermined women's rights, and has left countries ill prepared for the challenges of COVID and indeed of the climate crisis. And although there has been some shift of rhetoric at a global level from the IMF, in practice, at country level, pretty much nothing has changed. And if you look at the global austerity alert, the estimation is that 85% of the world's population will be living under austerity by the end of this year. And there is a really a serious concern that, in fact, post-COVID, we will see harsher austerity conditions imposed pretty much everywhere, and that public sector wage bill constraints tend to be one of those sort of centerpiece policies of austerity. In the 15 countries that we studied, we calculated that, in fact, the recommended cuts and freezes that the IMF had advised countries to make just in those 15 countries had blocked recruitment of 3 million frontline public sector workers just in those 15 countries. And we also calculated that if countries have been allowed to expand their tax to the public sector wage bill as a percentage of GDP by just 1 percentage point, an extra 8 million nurses or teachers could be recruited. When we challenge the IMF on this, one of the things that the IMF routinely say is that these are always temporary measures. They're always short term. It's only in an emergency that such constraints will be imposed. We found that's just fundamentally not true, that there was a consistent steer from the IMF to ministries of finance. Every country was told to cut or freeze at least for 3 years, and almost the majority for 5 or 6 years. And one of the most striking findings was that there was no clear logic, rationale, or evidence to justify when public sector wage bill constraints should be imposed. So that they were imposed, a cut to the percentage of GDP spent on the wage bill was advised for Zimbabwe when 17% of GDP was being spent on the wage bill, but so likewise, it was imposed and recommended in Liberia, which spends 10% of its GDP on the public sector wage bill, and Ghana, which spends 8% of its GDP on the wage bill, also advised to cut. But so was Senegal at 6.5%, Brazil at 4.6%, Nepal at 3.7%, even Uganda, which spends just 3.5% of its GDP on the public sector wage bill, was advised to cut. And most alarmingly of all, Nigeria, with just 1.9% of its GDP spent on the public sector wage bill, advised to cut. And what we found was that the medium-term advice from the IMF recommended that every country should cut its public sector wage bill so that it was below both the global average and the regional average. So it ends up with this never-ending downward spiral of countries forever being told to cut and squeeze. And if you think that that's the advice the IMF is giving everywhere, then the global and regional average is already being depressed anyway, and they're being constantly depressed further. Now, one of the questions which we asked ourselves was what are the alternatives? What alternatives should the IMF be offering to countries? If you're faced with supposedly a challenge, a financing of public services, well, one of the most obvious things, and one of the ones which actually is recommended by IMF policy documents from 2019 on how do you finance the SDGs, that one of the central pieces of advice by Gasper and co is that most countries could expand their tax to GDP ratios by 5 percentage points in the medium term. So say between now and 2030, most countries could reasonably credibly expand their tax to GDP ratios by 5 percentage points. Most low-income countries presently about 16% tax to GDP ratio. If those countries did expand by 5 percentage points, they could literally double their spending on education and on health and on social protection. So the question is, if that's in one of the key IMF documents about financing the SDGs, does that find its way down to country level advice? And what we found was, sadly, no, it does not. There was no consistent policy advice offered by the IMF to countries about expanding tax to GDP ratios. And when they did say something, it was always recommending regressive taxes such as VAT rather than progressive or redistributive taxes. So there are alternatives that could have been recommended, but they weren't. The IMF consistently chose to recommend as a centerpiece of its policy the cutting of the public sector budget. There were a number of other things about the dodgy use of data that we exposed, where countries would be randomly compared with other countries where they had no really credible comparison. They're constantly comparing the public sector wage bill with the private sector wages, but only ever to recommend a cut in the public sector, never the reverse. So that comparator is only ever used to drive things downwards. Very shockingly, there was never any evidence that they looked at the established data from the World Health Organization about shortages of nurses, or the UNESCO or other UN agencies about shortages of teachers. You know, if you're going to recommend public sector wage bill constraints, it would seem sensible that you would at least have a starting point where what's the present status of the workforce, where are there very clear shortfalls. That data was never used. And there was never any evidence of them using impact assessment, either ex ante or ex post impact assessment of what would be the impact of the public sector wage bill constraints in terms of cutting. One of the really interesting things that we found was the bizarre quotes in some of the Article 4 documents, which suggested that in order to increase social spending, you needed to cut social spending. It sounds almost incoherent. And what it actually means is you have to cut recurrent costs on the public sector wage bill in order to increase capital spending. Now, this is an absolute infrastructure sort of fundamentalism is what we called it, that when countries, are under, facing a recession, the recommendation is always, well, we'll protect capital spending and cut recurrent spending. Now, if you look at these from the lens, particularly of education, where 90% of the education budget goes on the public sector workforce, if you actually cut the recurrent spending and try to maintain capital spending, the effect of that is, in fact, to divert investment away from education and health, even when the IMF claims that it's trying to protect education and health as sectors, and it clearly does not work. So what it does is it sort of opens the door to privatization, of course, because if you've got capital spending, then you can forge nice partnerships with the private sector for the delivery or the building of things, but you can't exactly make a partnership with the private sector for the recruitment of teachers or nurses. So, yeah, I want to wrap up fairly quickly now. I mean, we have a series of recommendations, obviously, about the need for the IMF to move definitively away from the use of public sector wage bill constraints. The executive board removed this as a condition attached to loans in 2007, but has not fundamentally changed its direction of travel or the direction of its policy advice. And in the light of COVID and the learning from COVID and the central importance of public services and frontline services being protected, and in the light of the climate crisis, there needs to be a radical revisiting of the role of the public sector and of public services in terms of building more resilient and sustainable states. Clearly, there should be a much bolder investment in progressive tax reforms to expand tax to GDP ratios so that increased spending on public services is achievable. In the end, we sort of we think that there's lots of language we can say in terms of trying to shift practices in the IMF. We talk about it being an unconscious bias within the IMF, and maybe it's sort of they're not aware of how biased and prejudiced they are against the public sector. In practice, it's ideology. It's clearly ideology, but it doesn't help us to name that when we're having arguments with them. Last Friday, we had a very interesting initial discussion with about 15 senior economists from the IMF, from Fiscal Affairs Department, and also the World Bank people working on public sector wage bill constraints. We had a dialogue with PSI and EI and ActionAid and the Bretton Woods Project. There really is, I think, an opportunity to shift them, because they are so embarrassed by the evident impact that this has on undermining the goals on education and health, particularly. So using education and health in order to push back on this ideological agenda, I think, exposed in the contradictions as huge opportunities. The one thing which we wanted out of that dialogue last week was to open up a dialogue at a sub-regional level, so that we're going to now hopefully follow this up with dialogues in East, West and Southern Africa, in South Asia and in Latin America, bringing together union affiliates and activists to have a dialogue with the IMF and show them the evidence that we've collected about how incoherent. There is no evidence base for this policy, and therefore the ideology is exposed. That's more or less what I wanted to share today. I really look forward to hearing the other contributions as well. I will have to leave at some point a bit early, because I'm here in Paris for a summit on the transforming of education, and I'm supposed to be speaking in about 40 minutes. So thanks very much, and back over to you, David.
Okay, well, David, thanks for that. That's a terrific opening. And I was just going to ask you about your movements, because from what you said, you're going to be leaving by about 10 o'clock. So you're not going to be around for the main discussion. So can I just suggest that we just spend 5 minutes now, or 3 minutes or whatever, if people have got questions specifically about that contribution, because I think there's a lot of very important stuff in there, not least what you're saying about the embarrassed incoherence and lack of evidence, and the use of targets such as everybody's got to reduce their levels to below average, which leads to a slight indefinite cycle. And indeed the long-term effects. So if I can just start this with, you said that the IMF also insists that the advice is always temporary and the policies are always temporary. But I mean, in my casual experience over the years, I think not. And in a sense, this question is partly for Zico, that my impression is that India still has a rule of not employing any more civil servants at national level, which was originally introduced under IMF pressures 2 decades ago or something incredible.
I don't recall it.
Sorry?
I don't recall about the civil services at this point.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So did you have any more evidence of those policies surviving long term in government policies?
I mean, the answer is yes. We repeatedly found most countries, I say every country, at least 3 years, and most countries which we were looking at the data on over 5 or 6 years. And my impression, and because we were only looking at documents going back 6 years, if we had looked at a 20-year cache of documents, I think we would have consistently found the same advice. Now, some governments may, in the meantime, have increased in practice the public sector wage bill as a result of having to respond to strong union pressure and public sector strikes. So whenever there was a rise in the public sector wage bill, it would have been as a result of protests or strikes, not as a result of the steer. There was never any evidence of a steer to increase the public sector wage bill from the IMF. So the advice seems to be consistently to drive it down. And I think we have to be a bit careful about whether we attribute all of the evil to the IMF or to the ministries of finance who have internalized the same ideology. And they sort of play off each other, and it's so usefully sometimes being able to blame each other.
Yeah.
So one of the things we end up arguing is that there's this sort of cult of austerity, and it's a shrinking cult, but unfortunately people who are in powerful positions in ministries of finance around the world tend to be members of that same cult alongside the IMF, tend to see their career progression as being with the IMF or the World Bank afterwards. There's often a revolving door, people who get to be ministers of finance and people who have played a role at the IMF or the World Bank. So there's this very small cabal of people who share this ideology. And actually the best place to challenge it in practice is at country level by building strong coalitions of movements, linking public sector unions with wider public sector coalitions, tax and fiscal justice and feminist and youth movements, in order to challenge their own national government to resist that or to expose the ideology behind that set of ideas.
Okay, thanks for that, David. I mean, that obviously is what you say about not blaming the IMF. I mean, it's one advantage of focusing on narratives as opposed to institutions that we address that. And I just want to pick up one other thing that you said, which I think you called infrastructure fundamentalism, and that you cut current spending on wages in order to finance infrastructure investment. And maybe what Damon's going to be saying about what's happened in the USA could be quite interesting in that respect, because I think one thing in the Biden plans was precisely a shift in that narrative about infrastructure and what counts as infrastructure. Yeah. So look, thanks very much indeed for that. That's a great way to open. I'm now going to move on to Olivier Herdeman. And Olivier, big welcome and thanks very much for agreeing to speak. Olivier, I think it's fair to say, has been a thorn in the side of corporate Europe for over 20 years now, and a very effective one. This contribution is based on work that Olivier and CEO have been doing to halt the EU push to complete the single market, which in itself is a very striking phrase. They have a plan, and this is their plan. And so what Olivier is going to share with us is what that plan is, how long it's been going, and why it's important to recognize it and stand up to it. Olivier, over to you. And of course, share your screen if you have a presentation. Thanks very much. Over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, David. I'll just start sharing the screen indeed, and I'm still visible. That's perfect. Yeah. So yeah, I'm very honored to be invited to this event and to this debate. I work with Corporate Europe Observatory. Indeed, we're a watchdog group. We're working to expose the impact of corporate lobbying on EU decision making, and we're also campaigning to challenge that influence and to challenge the corporate capture of key pieces of EU legislation, working with trade unions and civil society groups to create counterpower as well. So we're zooming in on a lot of individual cases of EU decision making where there's a lot at stake for the public interest, but there's also, it's also important to say that it's not just a collection of individual battles. We're indeed also fighting a strategic project that is being promoted by large corporations and by the lobby groups in Europe. A project that is basically intends to deepen the neoliberal governance of European economies and European societies. And one of the centerpieces in that strategic project is indeed, as you said, David, the idea that the single market needs to be completed. So completing the single market, this kind of buzzword or phrase, is used a lot in by EU decision makers, by corporate lobby groups. So I'll be focusing my presentation on this. And what's very important to say from the start is that large corporations and lobby groups, they have a crucial ally in this strategic project, and that is the European Commission, or rather parts of the European Commission, very powerful parts of the European Commission, particular Commission departments that really see it as their mission to continuously seek to further deregulate and liberalize European economies as part of this completing of the single market. Parts of the European Commission that have a very negative view on public services as a starting point based on a neoliberal ideology that they have internalized for many years, and also a very limited view of what the role of the public sector should be. They want that role to be limited to provide a framework for business to operate and provide services and so on. So very far from the kind of vision that I think we all have for public services and for the public sector. So there is an ongoing, very strong marketization agenda, and it does target public services very much. And it also targets more broadly the right of public authorities to regulate, the right to pursue public interest goals in the local economy via rules, via planning, and so on. And on this first slide, you see some examples of some of the major initiatives, and there's just a few examples. In 2005, the EU Services Directive, which was kind of a big bang attempt to liberalize all services sectors across the board. It's often referred to as the Bolkestein Directive, named after the highly neoliberal Dutch commissioner at the time. That sparked a major pushback from trade unions, from NGOs, from progressive politicians. And in the end, some important sectors were exempted from the Services Directive, but many were not. So it was a key battlefield where a lot was lost and some temporary, or at least some important gains were made as well. Then in 2011, the Concessions Directive, which directly focused on public services and was the demand that all public services should be offered as in concessions on the EU-wide market. And again, a strong mobilization by civil society and trade unions managed to get water exempted from the Concessions Directive. Then maybe lesser known, but very important, in 2017, a proposal for a so-called Services Notification Directive. That was 10 years after the Services Directive, the European Commission and industry not being satisfied with what had been agreed in 2005, 6, 7, and wanting to really deepen the enforcement of the Services Directive. And they proposed basically a very strict governance framework in which all public authorities would have to submit planned decisions for how to regulate the services economy on the city level, on the national level, on the regional level. And they had to do that 3 months before the decision was to be taken, and first wait for approval from the European Commission. And of course, knowing that the part of the European Commission that would look at these decisions, these planned decisions, has a very neoliberal agenda and a very strong industry bias, this would have been a disaster for the right to regulate the services economies. And that directive was actually withdrawn as a result of a strong campaign, again by trade unions, by NGOs, and by mayors of progressive cities around Europe. So this was a big victory. It's not been reported much, but a very important one. But what's important to realize is that one victory doesn't mean that we have won for long. These are temporary victories. And for example, the water being exempted from the Concessions Directive, that is now being reviewed by the European Commission, whether that should still be the case. The Commission was, as planned, a study looking into the economic costs of exempting water from the directive. So that shows clearly what the viewpoint is, a very limited viewpoint. Again, here it is positive to see that trade unions and civil society groups have spoken out very clearly and told the Commission that they would be furious if the Commission would again propose to get water included in the Concession Directive. And it looks for now like the Commission has cold feet and it may not happen, but it just shows that these battles are ongoing. And then finally, and this I will come back to later, there is unfortunately a new, very major push on the way to complete the single market, which we should be very alert to. But I'll come to that. Now, all of these initiatives that I mentioned before, they're all justified by this narrative of completing the single market. The idea that the single market is far from complete, that there are all these obstacles, regulatory barriers, divergence, rules and regulations and so on that are unacceptable and very problematic. It's a narrative, and it's very much a flawed narrative. It might interest you to know that the academic research has shown that actually the US single market is far less completed than the European one. There's far more space for states and for cities to decide what type of public interest rules they want to introduce than there is in Europe. So actually the single market is highly completed and highly enforced as well, but this is not the narrative. Yeah, there is a very tightly knit enforcement system for the single market, and that's so in addition to these high-profile initiatives that come very regularly, there's also the day-to-day enforcement. And on the slide here, you can see just some of the acronyms of these different enforcement mechanisms. The Solvit procedure complaints handling system called CHAP, some newer initiatives like the EU pilot project, the single market scoreboard, and several others. And this is a whole machinery, very, very tightly knit, that strikes down on a lot of different types of regulation introduced on the national level, on the city level, on all levels of government in Europe. So that is the reality of the single market, and it not being completed. That's very much a flawed narrative. I just want to give two examples very concretely of how this enforcement works and how it's a tool for corporations to promote their interests. And I can refer you to this article you can see on the screen now called "The Obsession to Complete the Single Market." All of what I'm talking about is in there in more detail, and also the two cases that I want to mention. The two examples, they show very clearly how this continuous push to complete the single market clashes very directly with the need that is felt strongly across Europe today, more strongly than maybe 10 years ago, that strong proactive public policies are needed to solve societal challenges, whether it's ecological or social challenges. It also clashes very directly with some of the EU's own stated objectives, like the European Green Deal. One of the examples involves a tiny public authority, which is the Spanish island council Formentera, and the other involves a very powerful EU member state, which is France. I'll just summarize them very briefly to make it a bit more concrete of how this works. So the case of the island of Formentera started with the lobby group of German holiday home owners submitting a complaint to the European Commission. Now, this lobby group is to a large extent a mouthpiece of Airbnb, and it wants to remove restrictions to Airbnb operating and profiting from rental services in Europe. So Formentera had introduced some new local rules to protect the housing markets from getting far too expensive, but also to protect the local economy, because the local environment, because it's a very vulnerable ecological ecosystem on Formentera with lack of water and so on. So they wanted to limit the amount of tourism, basically escape the mass tourism trap. So the complaint was taken up by the Commission, and they sent a long letter criticizing Formentera for introducing these rules and arguing that they agreed with the lobby group that these rules violated the single market freedom to provide services. So, and asking quite a long list of questions, which Formentera then had to respond to. So David versus Goliath battle here between the European Commission with its whole administrative and legal apparatus and this tiny Spanish island. Yeah, The other case, very briefly, the French government has introduced in its climate law a ban on short distance flights between cities where there's also a good high-speed train connection. There, the French and the European airport lobbies submitted a complaint to the European Commission, and the Commission took up this complaint. This ban, which is part of the climate policy of France, part of the European Green Deal, supposedly violates the single market and the right to operate airport services. So this case is being investigated, has been under investigation for 8 months now. And it will really be a test case for this conflict between the right to regulate and the single markets. Okay, I will go to the next slide. I've already talked about enforcement. Yeah. So I mentioned at the beginning that there is a new major initiative looming to so-called complete the single market. And that started in December with a report from the European Roundtable of Industrialists, which is one of Europe's most powerful lobby groups involving CEOs from more than 50 large corporations. They launched this report claiming that there was a very major problem with regulatory obstacles in the single market. It was holding back the economy. And as I've given some examples of course, these regulatory barriers are in fact most often entirely legitimate and even crucial rules. Now, the European Roundtable of Industrialists demanded that the EU gives the European Commission much stronger rules to strike down on local or national rules and regulations initiatives that could be considered regulatory obstacles. So that was in December. Then we go to more recently, actually yesterday, a new initiative from the European Roundtable of Industrialists together with 4 other major industry groupings in Europe, including Business Europe, repeating the same demands. So insisting that the EU really scales up its single market enforcement, a comprehensive program to remove barriers in the single market, 180% change in the approach, they argue. And now with reference to the current situation in Europe, where there's a war in Ukraine, there's a looming energy crisis, and there's a recession and of course a price of living crisis as well. And all of these problems, very severe problems, the ERT considers political opportunities for a breakthrough in these long-standing ambitions that they have had to tighten the screws on regulations in Europe that they dislike. So that is something that is that's happening right now. Tomorrow there's a summit in Brussels of EU leaders, and the ERT launched their initiative for that. So clearly it's time for us to again mobilize trade unions, civil societies, progressive public officials and parties to prevent this campaign from succeeding. Finally, 2 initiatives that I want to invite you to join. We are in Corporate Europe Observatory with some allies launching a research project in which we want to go a bit deeper into these issues. So I mentioned some examples of cases of how single market enforcement creates big problems. But we want to, with this research project, really go deeper into the extent to which single market rules and the enforcement system creates obstacles for the social and the ecological transformation that we need in Europe. So we have a number of academic allies, society allies as well, but we really invite you to contact us if you would like to get involved in this. There is a huge research task there to get to the bottom of the size of this problem and the impact of these problems. And secondly, very concretely, I'd also like to invite you to a strategy workshop that we are co-hosting during the European Summer University of Social Movements that happens in the end of August in Mönchengladbach in Germany. And that workshop is, well, we'll be, of course, looking at this challenge of this new push for major deregulation in Europe and how to respond to this. But we're also hoping to look at the bigger question And that is, how can we as social movements go from the current situation where we're fighting defensive battles against one of these liberalization initiatives after the other, and go into the offensive and see how we can really, in a lasting manner, reclaim the democratic space that's needed, and firmly protect public services in Europe, because that is the only way to get out of this negative spiral that we're facing. So I will end here, and thank you a lot. I look forward to the discussion. As mentioned, don't hesitate to contact me if you would like to cooperate on any of this. Thanks.
Terrific. Thanks very much for that, Olivier, for a really lucid account of a little understood and little appreciated great combined strategy by the EU and corporate Europe lobbyists. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in the discussion. I'd now like to call on Damon Silvers, I think, would actually be the logical next step, and then we'll follow with Zico. Is that okay with you, Zico, if we end up with you, because you'll be then talking about the general sort of theoretical issues after all the overviews? That's terrific. Damon Silvers, we're doubly lucky to have Damon because he has two pretty strong qualifications for this discussion and this issue. Firstly, he was for 10 years policy director of the AFL-CIO, which is in effect the US Labour Union Confederation. And he's still a senior advisor at the AFL-CIO. Secondly, he's also a visiting professor at UCL IIPP, which is hosting this conference. And so he's both one of the leading trade unionists in the USA and a leading scholar on these issues. Damon's agreed to talk to us about US policy under President Biden and also the formation of that policy. So Damon, I'll hand over to you, and thanks very much indeed for agreeing to speak. And please feel free, obviously, to share your screen and
all right, great. Thank you, David. I'm just trying to get the screen in front of you. All right, and then get to the beginning of the screen. All right, can you hear me fine?
Yes, we can.
All right, wonderful, David. Thank you. So first, let me just say it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and thank you for the invitation. What I'm going to present here are both my views and, I think, in summary, the views of the AFL-CIO about President Biden's economic agenda. The opportunity to speak here to you all, not just about the agenda in substance, but about the formation of it and its implication for democratic politics with a small d, meaning not politics of the Democratic Party, but the politics of democracy. Is a really great pleasure, and I think at this moment so important. I want to begin just by emphasizing this point, and I think both the prior presentations touch on the same kind of issue from different perspectives, which is the role of political regime in shaping how governments approach the question of investment, of innovation, and of broad economic policy, broad macro policy, monetary and fiscal, in this period of crisis. And it's in that spirit that I'm going to try to address the recent history of the Biden administration. So I want to begin really by a bit of background, because I think this is important in understanding sort of what the Biden administration's economic policies are and sort of and where they came from. the American labor movement, not just the AFL-CIO, which is our labor federation, but the unions that are not affiliated with us, we have had a pretty consistent and if I might say so, well thought through set of economic policies that we have urged on governments, pretty much in this form since the economic crisis in 2008 and in 2007, 2008, 2009. And the labor movement's economic agenda in the United States, and I'm not here addressing our trade policies, although if you think about trade policy, you'll see that it fits into this. But our economic agenda had three pillars to it, and a fourth that's sort of necessary to make the three substantive ones work. First, to strengthen worker bargaining power in the United States through a combination of macro policies supporting full employment, a $15 minimum wage, and a number of other policies necessary to close loopholes around the minimum wage, and labor law reform that would make organizing and collective bargaining a meaningful reality once again in the private sector in the United States. So recall that union density in the private sector in the US is now under 7%. The 1970s, it was in the 20s. In the 1950s, it was in the 30s. And as a result of the weakening of collective bargaining in the United States, there's been a structural disconnect between wages and productivity in the US labor market since the late 1970s. So increase worker bargaining power and reconnect wages and productivity. B, fundamentally strengthen workers' economic security through policies around healthcare, education, housing, social pensions, childcare, and other social services. Now, for our European colleagues, I think people are aware the United States' social welfare structure is extremely limited, I think, compared to what is standard, particularly in continental Europe. And so this second piece is, I think, a little surprising for some Europeans that we don't have these things already. And then thirdly, and this is something of an innovation compared to where the labor movement was in the past, a support for massive investments in infrastructure and education designed to drive productivity in the United States. And obviously productivity and worker bargaining power are linked here. There's an implicit economic model here. And then finally, recognizing that the U.S. tax system has been substantially hollowed out. I won't go into the details of all the different ways in which it's been hollowed out since the Reagan administration in the 1980s. But there's been a long-term decline, both in overall revenues in relation to GDP, and in particular in corporate tax revenues. And so we had a full menu of corporate tax reforms designed both to close very significant loopholes that had emerged in that system, and also to raise the base rates to levels which could support in a sustainable way the initial agenda. So this is what the American labor movement has been arguing for more than a decade, and it's important to understand that the baseline here before President Biden's election is that this is an agenda and a way of thinking about the economy that had not really been fully embraced by many of the politicians that the labor movement supported. Our fundamental engagement around this agenda during much of this period, particularly when President Obama was president, was around trying to persuade the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party, to embrace this agenda. There was, I think, if you look back at the Obama administration's policies during the crisis, even when they were at their most fiscally expansionary moments in the first year of the administration, it was very much seen as, you go back and look at statements of Larry Summers and other people senior in the Obama administration, they saw the Keynesian spending as temporary emergency measures, and were very hesitant to embrace a vision of the kind of virtuous cycle between public investment and wage growth that was core to what the labor movement was looking to do. So this is where we start. Now, when the Biden administration when the 2020 elections are underway and the Biden campaign is formulating its policy agenda, it is doing so against a growing realization in American policymaking circles, in the Democratic Party and more broadly, that we were facing a series of very serious and intertwined crises, some of which were obvious, and we all lived through them in very pointed ways, no matter where we lived, and some of which were somewhat specific to the United States. And I also think that they're they're comparable, in many cases comparable to dynamics in the United Kingdom. But these crises were understood to be looming over our country while the Biden campaign and the Biden transition team during the period from roughly 2018 to February 2021 was formulating the Biden administration's agenda. So these crises are first, and I think this is the most important crisis underlying the Biden agenda, is the realization by a number of people who in the past might not have thought this way, that the United States was suffering from a serious long-term crisis of deindustrialization and resulting inequality, which had multiple consequences, each of whose seriousness was increasingly evident. A long-term structural lack of demand, which was causing permanent imbalances in the U.S. economy that were leading to other problems, particularly financialization and financial crises. A. B. Regional social crises associated with deindustrialization, and both in urban and rural America. The sort of urban crises that you might be familiar with, associated with some of our major post-industrial cities, Baltimore, Detroit, Cleveland, and also broad measures of social crisis in areas where there was dispersed industry, in the rural Midwest, rural New England, opioid addiction, a whole range of increasingly serious social problems, visible in the data, declining life expectancy in some places. And then finally, and this is the sort of thing that really got people's attention in the Biden world, the political crisis that flowed from that. Trump's successful performance in the areas most affected by deindustrialization in the 2016 election, and the threat in the 2020 election that he would do the same, that he would win the areas where deindustrialization had the biggest impact. Those states, he did not win those states in 2020, but had he won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, he would be president today, most likely. The electoral math is escaping me at the moment, but I believe that's true, that if he had won all three of them, he would still have been president. And so part of formulating this agenda that I'm about to talk about was winning the election and understanding where the election had to be contested. So that crisis loomed large. Secondly, obviously, in 2020 and 2021, we were in the depths of the COVID crisis and associated economic and social consequences, mass unemployment, and in our system of very weak social welfare provision, economic and health insecurity problems on a very large scale. Third, climate change. where the United States had withdrawn from the Paris Accords and was and the Biden administration, the Biden team, as they formulated their campaign platform, was thinking about how do we catch up? How do we get back to a position of responsibility and indeed leadership where we had been under President Obama in the context of the Paris Accords? And then finally, sort of over top of all of this, and of course this last one has now become somewhat acute, over top of all of this was long-term questions about the United States' place in an increasingly multipolar world as China began to catch up with the United States in the overall size of its economy, the scale of its military, and as certain kinds of, and as demographic change in the United States meant that essentially the U.S. is the question of what is the national definition of the United States it was sort of in play out there, and obviously Donald Trump had an answer to that, sort of delusional and violent one, but there was definitely a sense in the Biden team that there had to be a story about where we were going as a country in a world that was a substantially different place than it was in 1970 or 1980. So this is the background to policy formation in the Biden team. Now, the point I want to make, and I think David was pushing me to make about the policy formation of the Biden administration, was that it was the consequence of a set of pretty productive interactions between a variety of stakeholders and sources of expertise, which developed a new kind of economic and policy consensus, significantly different from that which had motivated both the Obama and the Clinton administrations, and in which public investment and public engagement with and public sector engagement with innovation was really central, as opposed to being something that we did kind of furtively in an emergency. Public investment and public engagement with innovation and the collaboration of the public sector with the labor movement was in the Biden administration at the center of their policy thinking. And so I'm just gonna go through quickly the sort of examples of sort of who the players were in this process. And let me also say, for those of you who follow US politics, you know, there was obviously a kind of interaction between President Biden and his rivals for the nomination, for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2020. So it's important to recognize that the Biden administration's policy agenda was one that was developed ultimately in the back and forth with people like Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, and Bernie Sanders in the primary process. In addition to these elected officials, in addition to these candidates, rivals whose thinking affected the Biden team, there was a process of dialogue involving former elected officials and appointees in the prior Democratic administrations. And I'll just give one example. Jake Sullivan, who's now the National Security Advisor, was involved in a substantial project looking at the impact of prior economic policy on industrially dependent communities in the Midwest. Jake had been involved in what one might call, you know, neoliberal trade policy under the under the Obama and Clinton administrations. The study he was involved in effectively questioned whether that had really been such a good idea. Gene Sperling, who is now helping to administer the American Rescue Plan, I'm going to come to in a moment. Gene engaged in a similar project, published a book advocating for a much more robust a set of federal spending policies in areas like childcare and elder care. expansions of the child tax credit. So you had people previously involved in more neoliberal policy initiatives, more neoliberal approaches to policy, rethinking those ideas during the run-up to the 2020 campaign. Critically, they interacted with the work of people in the academy whose voices and data was increasingly influential during this period. My colleague and the director of the IIPP, Mariana Mazzucato's work on the government's role in innovation and market shaping, Thomas Piketty's work on inequality and tax, Joe Stiglitz's sort of systemic questioning of the neoliberal order, all were very important background forces in these conversations. And also and I didn't put this on the slide, but the rethinking of neoliberal trade policy in the context of the actual data about its impact on wage levels in the United States by people who previously had been, supporters of neoliberal trade models. Paul Krugman was kind of the popularizer of this work, but a lot of it was done by people, by others. This also was a very important backdrop to where the Biden administration came out. Thirdly, think tanks, both labor-affiliated think tanks and sort of left think tanks, and also increasingly centrist think tanks, developed a whole body of work essentially saying that the Clinton and the Obama administrations had sort of insufficiently focused on issues of inequality, issues of labor, issues of worker organizing, worker rights, and issues of public spending and public investment. So the Economic Policy Institute, which is significantly supported by the AFL-CIO and its affiliates, the Roosevelt Institute, on which I'm a fellow. I left the Century Foundation off, whose board I sit on, another institution that played in this space, Demos, and then then more the centrist institutions like the Center for American Progress and Brookings followed the more left-wing institutions in the direction of the kinds of ideas that were sort of suggested by the academics and by the rethinking of the administrations. The labor movement was an important source here of both ideas and of political strength behind those ideas. As I outlined before, what our agenda was, we were very engaged in talking with all the campaigns, and we had been engaged with all of these people, with the think tanks, with the academics, with the elected officials, going back through the Trump administration, back to the Obama administration, and even earlier into the Bush administration, when the Obama policies were being formulated. I note particularly the role of labor-business collaboration, and I'll come back to this in a moment because this is important in terms of what happens later. When it comes particularly to the idea of very large-scale infrastructure investment, in an era of increasing polarization in American public life and polarization between labor and business, where the kinds of labor-business collaborations that were commonplace in the 1960s and 1970s even have become almost non-existent, there continued to be a very robust common agenda and common lobbying effort by the labor movement and the business community around the public infrastructure investment. And that helped support where the Biden administration went. A new force here, relatively new force, was the role of non-governmental organizations, both organizations in areas that might in the past not have been central to economic policy, like the environmental movement, youth efforts, the Sunrise Movement, which was behind the Green New Deal push that AOC and others championed, the National Domestic Workers Alliance that was pushing very hard for a dramatically expanded home health care and elder care initiative. These organizations were very important in rounding out the comprehensive public investment agenda that David referred to that involved both physical infrastructure and human infrastructure. And then finally, something that, again, I think is where the United States and Germany have a lot in common, but which is quite different from how the United Kingdom, say, or France functions, is that is the role in policy formulation of state and local government as independent sources of public policy making, of public investment, as some people have referred to as laboratories of innovation within the American political system. So we saw initiatives in progressive state and local government that, such as the offshore wind investments being promoted by the coastal states in the Atlantic, or California's building of high-speed rail, that sort of modeled the kinds of initiatives the Biden administration wanted to adopt. What was the result? The result of this work was the Biden administration's American Jobs Plan. And the American Jobs Plan is not a piece of legislation. It's a policy document that the Biden administration released in March 2021, envisioning a vast and comprehensive public investment agenda, workforce development agenda, labor rights agenda, because the vision was one in which strong worker rights were associated with all the public spending the Biden administration was putting forward. It's important to note here that the American Jobs Plan was really continuous with the American Rescue Plan, the initial very ambitious COVID recovery legislation that was passed, that was enacted into law in February of 2021. The American Rescue Plan, which a $1.9 trillion plan, included very significant support for local government, which in many cases basically turned into infrastructure investment and job creation, support for healthcare and retirement plans, go back to the labor movement's agenda, and strengthened extraordinary unemployment benefits for people laid off by COVID. The American Rescue Plan was from the labor movement's perspective an extraordinary piece of legislation that enacted pretty much the labor movement's entire detailed agenda for how to respond to the COVID crisis, an agenda we had fought for with some diminishing expectations of success through the last year of the Trump administration. With President Biden's election, we essentially accomplished the entirety of what we were seeking to do. Now,
sorry, can I just interrupt?
How much time? Am I running out of time?
I think so. If you can wind up over the next couple of minutes, because we still have Zico to speak. And
all right, I will speed it up very fast. So the Jobs Plan envisioned the largest public investment program in American history, and its goals were the goals of innovation, productivity, and meeting the climate targets. It was both physical and human infrastructure, and it was designed explicitly to be integrated with the labor movement, which is completely different from the way in which prior Democratic Party policy initiatives, all of which were relatively underpowered in the past, had been done. The American Jobs Plan was then turned into 3 pieces of legislation. As I said, the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan was passed in February. In September, a physical infrastructure bill, $1.2 trillion, the largest in American history in nominal dollars, was passed with the strong labor protections and engagement that President Biden's team had envisioned. As I think everyone knows, that the infrastructure plan aimed at essentially is planned to help the United States go halfway on its Paris targets. The other half was measures part of the Build Back Better bill that got stalled. It got blocked in the United States Senate in December. The fate of Build Back Better is now called Building a Better America, which includes measures of great importance to people in this room, is unclear. Now, I think people are familiar, if you read about American politics, with the challenges the Biden administration faces here. They're trying to do. Yep, they're trying to do.
Can I ask you?
I'm gonna hit these
Okay.
2 slides and conclude.
Okay.
The basic challenge here is the challenge of trying to do gigantic policy change with very narrow political, with very narrow political margins, and with the business community locked into right-wing politics, and with lingering problems with neoliberal ideology in the Democratic Party. The challenge now facing the Biden administration and facing the United States is can we get the other half of this done? That includes the child care, the home health care, the expansion of the healthcare system itself, and $600 billion in climate-related energy and infrastructure investment, plus the tax measures necessary to pay for it, and the comprehensive labor law reform, while facing the reality of an increasingly intense battle over the nature of democracy itself in the United States. David, thank you very much for your indulgence. I think hopefully this gives you a sort of flavor of how the economic policy issues and the democracy issues interact.
Terrific, Damon. Thanks very much indeed for that. No, I mean that we really wanted to hear about that process. Really, really rich, really remarkable, and really highly relevant to what we're talking about in terms of collaborations and developing new narratives on public services. So hopefully there'll be time in discussion to come back and pick up some of those points. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
For that. Okay, and now we're going to move on to the final contribution, which is from Zico Dasgupta. Zico is from the Azim Premji University, which is one of the core partners of this conference. And has played a really important role in shaping the agenda of the conference and bringing forward a number of contributions. So I'm very pleased indeed to be asking Zico to speak. And he's a professor of economics at Azim Premji, and his research combines both theoretical and empirical analysis of growth regimes, looks at employment issues and fiscal issues. Zico, over to you for 15 minutes on the theoretical issues around planning public services and public spending in overall growth context and with particular relevance to employment. Thanks very much indeed. Off you go.
Sure. Thanks a lot, David. I'm so excited to be a part of this fascinating discussion. Let me share my screen. All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
this presentation is essentially on theoretical issues on public employment. What this presentation tries to do is to address 2 distinct issues. The first issue is more often discussed and frequently debated and well known, which is the role of government expenditures per se in creating employment. But more than that, the second issue has been less discussed, and this relates to the nature of expenditures for employment generation. It can be noted that Keynes's own magnum opus, the general theory of employment, interest, and money, talked about government expenditures in general. It didn't talk about the nature of expenditures, and that has come to the forefront of debate at this present point of time, with wide range of debates between the kind of expenditures: capital expenditures or employment generating schemes involving revenue expenditures. What are the conditions under which each kind of expenditures work or don't? Is there any case to prefer revenue expenditures or employment generating schemes over what is termed as the capital expenditures? What should be the nature of expenditures given the kind of growth and employment regime that we frequently come across? These are the kind of issues that we're going to discuss. All right. So firstly, a broad overview of how employment has been perceived and the level of employment determination has been explained within different theoretical frameworks. Broadly, these alternative frameworks can be divided into two components. One can be perceived as the neoclassical view, and the other can be perceived as the heterodox view. Broadly, the well-known features are well known to everyone, but just to reiterate, there are three distinguishing features of the neoclassical view as far as employment is concerned. First of all, within this view, involuntary unemployment would exist only on account of wage rigidity. And that is precisely the reason within this framework, there is a great advocacy for labor reform policies. Because unemployment can only exist according to this view because of high wage rates, labor reform policies become an intrinsic portion of this neoclassical view. The second feature pertains to the fact that the claim is that the flexibility of wages and prices guarantees full employment. And by implication, the third feature, that it's a proposition of policy relevance. Full employment or more or less full employment can be achieved without government expenditures. There is a sort of automatic adjustment mechanism in the economy that ensures that the economy is at full employment. Alternatively, there are different kinds of heterodox views, different kinds of theoretical frameworks, but the common features would be the following: that over here, involuntary unemployment would exist with or without wage rigidity. This can be either due to the demand constraint as argued by Keynes, or it can be due to capital goods constraint as well, sheer lack of availability of capital goods. And in either cases, it is only by fluke that an economy attains full employment on its own. And hence the role of government expenditures, and higher government expenditure reduces involuntary unemployment by relaxing either the demand or the capital goods constraint. Now, given the two alternative views of looking at employment and strategies of reducing unemployment, a few points are in order, particularly on the neoclassical view and the assumptions. The neoclassical view seems to be based on at least two set of unrealistic assumptions, and which is crucial for their conclusion that an economy automatically settles to the full employment output. And these two assumptions are again well known, but I'll reiterate it in any way. First, there is no role of fundamental uncertainty in the sense that investment decisions are same as savings decisions. There is no role of animal spirits or subjective probability in investment decisions. There is no coordination problem among firms, and which means that the micro capitalists or firms behave in a similar manner as like a macro social planner, which means they exactly know what kind of investment is required for the economy to settle at the full employment output. The second assumption is that there is no role of liquidity preference in the sense that money and finance plays no additional role other than transaction purposes. No speculative demand for money, which means that it is the interest rate which always clears the market. Say's law holds. And finally, the conclusion that production always creates an equivalent level of expenditures. There is no demand constraint. And for some reason or the other, if expenditures are lower than production, no one needs to do anything. The government need not do anything whatsoever. There will be a mechanism in the market, interest rate adjustments, by which the economy will settle back to the full employment output. But nonetheless, as Keynes had pointed out, that all these assumptions seem to be unrealistic. And the moment one takes away these assumptions from the neoclassical perspective, the entire conclusion of full employment output falls apart. And hence comes the role of government expenditures. I will not get into this debate in details, which has been otherwise frequently debated, the role of government expenditures, why state intervention is required in increasing the level of employment per se. What I would focus on is essentially the nature of public spending that we talk about in heterodox perspective. Now, of course, in the demand constrained systems or heterodox view, there exists no automatic adjustment by which economy settles to full employment output, and hence public spending becomes very crucial for ensuring full employment. But nonetheless, a distinction which was not made in Keynes, but becomes increasingly important perhaps at the present age of globalization, is that there can be two kinds of role of government expenditures. And depending on the manner in which public spending generates employment, we would like to distinguish into two types of government expenditures. One, which we shall term as employment enabling, and the other, which can be termed as employment producing. Now, employment enabling role of government, this corresponds to either fiscal stimulus aimed at increasing aggregate demand, or increasing capital expenditures aimed at increasing both demand or relaxing capital constraints. What is the objective? The objective is to create employment by increasing the output growth rate and profits of the economy. Because there is greater output, the labor demand increases, and that's the entire purpose of these kinds of government expenditures. It is employment enabling in the sense that the government provides the incentive structure for people to get hired. It does so by involving the output channel. So that's the crucial feature of employment enabling role. In contrast, there can be an employment producing role as well. Now, this corresponds to government expenditures in employment generation schemes or salaries within public sector. Over here, the government generates employment directly. The objective is to produce employment independent of its implication for profits or output growth rate. The domain of employment generation is necessarily outside private sector. Now, these two kinds of roles of government expenditures becomes particularly important in categorizing different kinds of fiscal policy or government expenditures, it seems. So, for example, fiscal policy in the employment enabling rule would typically target output growth rate at any given employment rate. It involves undertaking expenditures that have high multiplier values, and that would be typically capital expenditures, expenditures on infrastructures. It can be noted that this debate has particularly come up after COVID, where there is a need to increase government expenditures, but typically in different countries, including that in India, the essential focus has been on capital expenditures. And the argument has been that infra expenditures and different kinds of capital expenditures have greater multiplier values as compared to other kinds of expenditures. And this essentially fulfills what can be termed as the employment enabling role of the government. Now, in contrast, fiscal policy in its employment producing role targets employment growth rate per se at any given output growth rate. Now, this involves undertaking expenditures that directly increases jobs. Typically, this would involve current expenditures or revenue expenditures, wages and salaries, expenditures incurred as salaries in different employment generation schemes. The kind of expenditures are fundamentally different. And the crucial difference is that the multiplier value of capital expenditures are typically greater than the revenue or the current expenditures. And this crucial argument has been provided by many people, even those who are convinced by the Keynesian logic that government expenditure needs to be increased, particularly during the pandemic to address the unemployment question. The preference has been more towards capital expenditures. And this is the one argument or one reason for this, of course, that given the fiscal policy rules and macroeconomic policy framework, which compels different government to abide by a specific debt GDP ratio, high multiplier value expenditures really helps in maintaining that rule and maintaining that constraint. Now, here comes the central question. That does this mean that fiscal policy should only involve capital expenditures, fulfilling employment enabling role, because it maximizes growth as well as generates greater employment growth rate? Or does there exist a case for employment producing role as well, with greater revenue expenditures? And this is related to the question that what are the conditions under which employment producing role is greater, is preferable, is better? And this is the question that we will take we will try to address in the second part of this presentation. Now, this leads us to a crucial relationship between three things: the output growth rate, the technological progress, the labor productivity growth rate, and employment growth rate. I'll just get back to the previous slide to underscore the relationship between the two. By definition, employment growth rate can be defined as the difference between output growth rate and labor productivity growth rate. That's by definition. Now, what does it mean intuitively? It means the following: that greater the output growth rate, greater would be the labor demand, and hence greater the employment growth rate. Similarly, when one talks about labor productivity growth rate, what does one say? What one is essentially trying to imply that the same amount of output can be produced by hiring less number of workers. So higher the labor productivity, higher the automation, greater the labor saving technologies used in the production process, at any given level of output, lower would be the labor demand. In other words, employment growth rate is determined by the nature of or the level of output growth rate and labor productivity growth rate. And given this broad relationship, this relationship has been talked about and discussed pretty frequently in macroeconomic theory. And one crucial relationship, two crucial relationships would emerge out of these three variables. First of all, the manner in which output growth rate and labor productivity growth rate determines employment growth rate. And this is, of course, coming from the difference, employment growth rate as a difference between output growth rate and labor productivity growth rate. The second crucial relationship is the relationship between output growth rate and labor productivity growth rate in the first place. And this relationship between output growth rate and labor productivity growth rate goes back to the contribution of Nicholas Calder, the famous Cambridge macroeconomist. And the argument would be the following: that higher the output growth rate, it involves increasing returns to scale. It allows firms to introduce greater technologies, more sophisticated technologies, and hence the labor productivity growth rate also increases when the output growth rate increases. One can think of this in the following way: that if firms require a threshold level of profit to introduce new technology, greater the output, greater the profit, greater the possibility of those firms to introduce those labor saving technology. And hence there is a positive link between output growth rate and labor productivity growth rate. And this can be typically perceived as the situation till the 80s. And this, we can term this relationship as a triangle till the 80s. The triangular relationship between output growth rate, employment growth rate, and labor productivity growth rate. It was typically argued, it was typically perceived that the extent to which labor productivity growth rate rises when output growth rate rises, it's less than proportional, in the sense that when output growth rate rises by 1 unit, labor productivity growth rate would rise by less than 1 unit, such that any change in the output growth rate leads to a change in the employment growth rate itself. And this has been the crux or the basis of all the Keynesian policies or heterodox policies, which attempts to aim the output growth rate in the first place. The fact that capital expenditures are used to increase employment growth rate per se comes from this very presumption that even if labor productivity growth rate rises in response to output growth rate, the overall relationship would be positive. So that has been one crucial assumption behind undertaking what can be called as the employment enabling role of the government through capital expenditures. What changed during the globalization is the introduction of a fourth important factor in this relationship. And we shall call this as the quadrilateral of neoliberalism, in contrast to the triangle of the 80s. And this involves the added role of income distribution in this entire relationship between output growth rate on one hand and employment growth rate on the other. There are two kinds of relationship that needs to be talked about in the question of, in the context of neoliberalism and globalization. And the context is the sharp reduction in the income share of labor during globalization, a trend which has been well discussed, be it in Piketty or Milanovic. But this has important implication for the employment generation policies or the relationship between output and employment. First of all, growth during globalization, during neoliberalism, has been associated with lower income share of labor. And there has been two kinds of relationship between income share of labor on one hand and output growth rate on the other. The two kinds of relationship are the following. The first is that wage share typically depends on two things: the growth rate of real wage rate and the growth rate of labor productivity. The growth rate of wages typically depends on the bargaining power of workers. Globalization and neoliberalism has typically reduced the bargaining power of workers. And because output growth rate increases labor productivity growth rate as well through increasing returns to scale, output growth rate also associated with a lower wage share or lower income share of labor. In other words, in terms of this quadrilateral relationship, one can think of this, the relationship goes in the following way: that higher the output growth rate, higher the labor productivity growth rate, and lower the wage share, because the growth rate of nominal wage rate becomes more, or real wage rate becomes more or less stagnant during globalization. That's the first kind of relationship. The second kind of relationship goes from income distribution or income share of labor to output growth rate. One can think of this in multiple ways, but one important way is through the consumption channel. Typically, whenever the wage costs are reduced, it also reduces the demand or the consumption demand of the workers. It has been more or less empirically established that consumption propensity of the rich is typically lower than the consumption propensity of the workers. What does it mean? It means that for every unit of income, additional unit of income, the amount of consumption expenditures incurred by the capitalists or the elites, high income decile classes, are typically lower than the one by the workers or the poor. So income distribution typically has an impact on consumption demand and various aspects of aggregate demand. Now, so that would be the broad kind of a relationship between growth and distribution. The crux of the matter is that whenever output growth rate changes, it does have an impact on income distribution during the period of globalization. The second important relationship is between income distribution on one hand and labor productivity growth rate. In other words, the two blocks in the right hand side between the income distribution and labor productivity growth rate. And the relationship can be perceived in two alternative ways. Firstly, higher wage share can incentivize firms to introduce labor saving technology. In that way, the labor productivity growth rate gets affected by changes in income distribution. And alternatively, one can think of this, that the rich and the poor has different demand pattern, have different consumption baskets. The moment income distribution changes in favor of the rich, in favor of the elites, the consumption basket also changes in favor of the consumption basket of the elites. Typically, the consumption baskets of the elites are much more capital intensive, and hence the labor productivity growth rate of these subsectors are typically higher. And that's the reason why income distribution also has an impact on the labor productivity growth rate per se. Now, what does it imply? And the biggest implication can be perceived in terms of the Indian trend. This trend gives the trend in output GDP growth rate, the employment growth rate, and labor productivity growth rate during the decade of 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. There are two takeaway points from this figure. First of all, as you would see, that the GDP growth rate has increased in India during the 90s, during the 2000s, or during the liberalization period as compared to 80s. On average, the GDP growth rate of 2000s and 2010s have been higher than that of the 80s or even 90s. On the other hand, employment growth rate has not been higher. It has either remained stagnant or even has declined in the recent period. In other words, output growth rate has not synchronized with the trend in the employment growth rate. And the reason is that output growth rate has been associated with more than proportionate rise in the labor productivity growth rate. And this typically, I will not go into the details. What has been an important part is the change in the demand pattern in favor of the high productivity sectors due to changes in the income distribution in the economy. This figure largely talks about the sharp reduction in the income share of labor, the bottom 99%, as well as the wage share. And this figure tells us that wage share changes are associated with the changes in the demand pattern towards high productivity sector. I'll just end in one slide, one additional.
Thanks.
Slide. Yeah. And this has been associated with the divergence between output growth rate and employment growth rate in different sectors, including non-agricultural sector as well as the aggregate economy. What are the implications? There are two implications as such. Firstly, the target of output growth rate becomes analytically distinct from the employment target. It is possible that higher output growth rate can lead to proportional or more than proportionate rise in employment growth rate, which means that one can register jobless growth rate. Now, capital expenditures typically maximizes output growth rate. It works with the assumption that the response of labor productivity growth rate is weak in relationship to change in output growth rate. It is only under these conditions that capital expenditures work in generating or increasing employment growth rate. So the employment enabling role works over there. In the case where employment enabling role does not work is when the response of labor productivity growth rate is very high. And in this case, capital expenditures fail to generate enough employment because of the effect of labor productivity growth rate. In this case, the employment producing role becomes important, revenue expenditures become important, current expenditures become important, employment generation schemes become important. And finally, this leads us to rethink macroeconomic policy framework, either to change fiscal policy rule or to link corporate tax rates to the need of accommodating greater employment producing expenditures, and to identify the fact that the target of output can be different from the target of employment. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Okay, Zico, that was fantastic. And I think for all of us, I mean, it's clearly an unusually detailed, but beautifully focused and very clear presentation of economic arguments. And that final conclusion of yours is exactly of core relevance, namely whether the what you describe as the employment enabling role of the government can work in the conditions we have of globalized capital and rising productivity, and therefore the essential role of employment producing action by governments, i.e. direct employment or schemes. And this is very much creating a new narrative and big challenge to core orthodoxy. So thanks so much indeed. Look, we have run pretty much right up to the end of the time for the entire workshop, including discussion. Is there anyone out there who wants to put up their hand and raise a question? I know there's a lot of people out in the audience who have got a lot of interest in these issues. So I'm really sorry that the discussion time has pretty much been absorbed. But I hope that everybody feels that the contributions themselves have really been useful in clarifying these issues around planning and macroeconomic policy, and the role of strategic thinking about the role of public sector in the market, that we've been seeing the international institutions doing exactly this, and we need to start rethinking on an international level these kind of approaches. And the US example, I still think, is really encouraging for really quite a start of a radical rethinking of macroeconomic policy at a national level. And so I still think that reading out chunks of the AJP and saying the President of the United States said this is not a bad way to start moving forward with narratives. So thanks very much indeed to all our 4 presenters. That was fantastic, and I hope everybody enjoyed that. So this workshop ends here. There's another one starting in 15 minutes, which follows on the employment issues and the employment related issues of public spending and public services. So thanks very much, everybody. This is the end of this workshop.